Eddie Van Halen had been watching KISS perform from the side of the stage, studying Ace Frehley's technique. After the show, Eddie found Ace in his dressing room and said something that would become infamous among their mutual friends. "You're good at what you do. But could you handle Van Halen's material? Be honest." Ace, removing his spaceman makeup, looked at Eddie in the mirror. "I don't know. Can I borrow your guitar and find out?" 30 minutes later, Eddie Van Halen was sitting on a road case, jaw dropped, watching Ace Frehley play Eruption Note Perfect and then add his own variations that made Eddie grab a pen and start taking notes. It was August 1979 at the Oakland Coliseum. Van Halen was the opening act for KISS on what would be one of the biggest tours of the year. Two bands at very different points in their careers, representing two completely different philosophies about rock music. KISS was established, massive, the biggest theatrical act in the world. Van Halen was the new sensation, the band that was changing guitar playing forever with Eddie's revolutionary technique. The dynamic between the two bands had been interesting from the start. KISS represented spectacle, makeup, costumes, pyrotechnics, theater. Van Halen represented raw musical virtuosity, no gimmicks, no costumes, just four guys who could play their instruments at an almost superhuman level. And at the center of both bands were guitarists who, despite their different approaches, shared one thing: an absolute mastery of their craft. Eddie Van Halen had released his self-titled debut album the year before, and Eruption, his minute-and-a-half guitar solo, had changed everything. The two-handed tapping technique he'd showcased wasn't entirely new, but Eddie had perfected it, popularized it, and made it the standard by which technical guitar playing would be judged for decades. At 24 years old, Eddie was being called the greatest guitarist of his generation, and he was starting to believe it. That night in Oakland, Van Halen had played their set first, and Eddie had absolutely killed. The crowd had been enthusiastic, but Eddie noticed something. When KISS came on, the energy multiplied. The pyro, the makeup, the show. It was undeniable. The crowd went insane in a way they hadn't for Van Halen. And while Eddie understood it intellectually, understood that KISS was giving people a full sensory experience, part of him resented it. His band was musically superior, technically superior, and yet KISS got the bigger reaction because of theatrics. After KISS's set ended, Eddie found himself wandering backstage. He'd wanted to meet Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley for business reasons. They were savvy guys who'd turned rock into an empire. But as he walked past the dressing rooms, he heard guitar playing. Not amplified, just acoustic. Someone noodling on a guitar in that absent-minded way musicians do when they're winding down. Eddie followed the sound to Ace Frehley's dressing room. The door was half open, and inside, Ace was sitting in front of a mirror, still in his spaceman costume, but with half the makeup removed, playing an acoustic guitar. He was playing something bluesy and soulful, nothing technically complex, just feeling his way through some chord progressions. Eddie knocked on the open door. Ace looked up, his face half silver and black, half normal skin. "Hey," Ace said, setting down the guitar. "You're Eddie, right? Van Halen?" "Yeah," Eddie said, stepping inside. "That was a hell of a show you guys put on." "Thanks, man. You killed it earlier, too. That solo in Eruption, I was listening from back here. That's some crazy stuff." Eddie smiled. "Thanks. It's just technique, you know? Two-handed tapping. Been working on it for years." "It shows," Ace said, returning to removing his makeup. "Must take a lot of practice." "It does," Eddie agreed. Then, maybe because of the adrenaline still coursing through him, or maybe because of the slight resentment he'd been feeling, he added, "It's real playing, you know? Not just showmanship." Ace paused in wiping his face. His eyes found Eddie's in the mirror. "What do you mean by that?" Eddie immediately realized he'd crossed a line, but his ego kept him going. "No offense, man. KISS is great at what you do, the theater, the spectacle. But musically, it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, you guys are good at what you do, but could you handle Van Halen's material? Be honest." The dressing room went quiet. Ace slowly set down the towel he'd been using. He turned around in his chair to face Eddie directly. "I don't know," Ace said, his voice calm but with an edge. "Can I borrow your guitar and find out?" Eddie's confidence wavered for a second. "You want to try playing Van Halen stuff?" Why not? Ace asked. You just said it's all about technique. So let's see if the circus performer can handle the real music. That's what you're saying, right? Eddie realized this had gone from a casual backstage conversation to something else entirely. But he'd started it, and backing down now would look worse than whatever was about to happen. Okay, Eddie said. My guitar's in our dressing room. Come on. The walk down the hallway was silent. Roadies and crew members saw them together and sensed something was happening, the way people do when tension is in the air. Word spread quickly. By the time they reached Van Halen's dressing room, there were a dozen people following them, including David Lee Roth, who had an instinct for drama. What's going on? Roth asked, his voice carrying that theatrical quality he always had. Ace wants to try playing some Van Halen, Eddie said, pulling his guitar out of its case. His main guitar, the famous Frankenstein, the red, white, and black striped guitar that was already becoming iconic. This should be interesting, Roth said, a smile playing at his lips. He wasn't being mean, just genuinely curious about what was about to happen. Eddie handed the guitar to Ace. Ace took it, felt its weight, tested the neck. The action was different from what he was used to. The pickup configuration was unique to Eddie's modification, but Ace had been playing guitar since he was 13. He knew how to adapt. What do you want me to play? Ace asked. Your choice, Eddie said, sitting down on a road case. Play whatever you think will prove your point. Ace thought for a moment. He could play something safe, something he knew. But that would prove nothing. If he was going to do this, he needed to go straight at Eddie's ego. He needed to play Eddie's signature piece. How about Eruption? Ace said. The room went silent. Eruption wasn't just a song. It was Eddie's statement to the world. It was the piece that had announced his arrival as a generational talent. Attempting it was either brave or foolish. You know Eruption? Eddie asked, skeptical. I've heard it, Ace said. A lot. It's all over the radio. The tapping part is pretty distinctive. Knowing a song and playing it are two different things, Eddie said. Guess we'll find out, Ace replied. He plugged Eddie's guitar into a small practice amp someone had in the dressing room. The sound wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Ace positioned his fingers, took a breath, and started to play. The opening to Eruption is deceptively simple, a tremolo-picked section that leads into the more complex parts. Ace played it cleanly, his fingers finding the notes with surprising accuracy for someone playing it for the first time on an unfamiliar guitar. Eddie leaned forward slightly. His interest genuinely piqued now. Then Ace hit the tapping section, the part that had made Eddie famous. Two-handed tapping, the right hand hammering onto the fretboard instead of just picking, creating a cascading effect that sounded like something between a guitar and a piano. It was Eddie's innovation, his signature, his revolution. And Ace nailed it. Not perfectly, there were a couple of slight timing issues, a few notes that weren't quite clean, but he nailed the core of it. The technique was there, the understanding was there. This wasn't someone faking their way through. This was a real guitarist playing real music. Eddie's expression changed from skeptical to surprised to something approaching respect. The other people in the room were silent, watching, understanding they were witnessing something significant. Ace played through the entire piece, about 90 seconds of technically demanding guitar work, and when he finished, he let the final note ring out. Then he looked at Eddie. Not bad, right? Ace said. For a circus performer? Eddie stood up slowly. That was really good. How did you learn that so fast? I didn't learn it fast, Ace said. I've been playing guitar for 15 years. You think I haven't been paying attention to what you're doing? You think because I wear makeup I don't study technique? He handed the guitar back to Eddie. You're not the first person to invent tapping, you know. You're just the one who made it popular. But the technique has been around. I've been messing with it for years. I just don't showcase it the way you do because that's not what KISS is about. Eddie looked at his guitar, then at Ace. I underestimated you. I apologize. You want to know the real difference between us? Ace asked. It's not technical skill. We're both good. The difference is philosophy. You believe guitar playing is about demonstrating technical mastery. I believe it's about serving the song. Neither one of us is wrong. We're just different. David Lee Roth, who'd been watching the whole thing, started clapping slowly. That, he said, was beautiful. A guitar summit. Someone should have recorded this. Eddie was still processing. Can I ask you something? Why don't you showcase more of your technical ability in KISS songs? Why hide it? I'm not hiding it, Ace said. I'm using it appropriately. Every solo I play in KISS serves the song. It's not about showing off. It's about making the song better. Could I shred all over every track? Sure. But why? That's not what the song needs. But doesn't that frustrate you? Eddie asked, genuinely curious now. Having ability you don't fully display? Ace thought about this. No, because I get to make millions of people happy. I get to be part of something bigger than just my guitar playing. KISS isn't about me showing everyone how good I am. It's about creating an experience. The makeup, the fire, the show. That's not compensation for lack of skill. It's enhancement of skill in service of entertainment. Eddie sat back down. His entire demeanor changed. I think I've been looking at this all wrong. You think? Ace said, but he was smiling now. The tension had broken. Okay, my turn, Eddie said. You played my song. I want to try playing like you. Show me something from a KISS song. Teach me a solo. Ace was surprised. You want to learn KISS? Yeah, Eddie said. Show me, shock me. That's your song, right? You sing it? For the next 30 minutes, the two guitarists sat together, Eddie's Frankenstein being passed back and forth, each one teaching the other, each one learning not just techniques, but philosophies. Ace showed Eddie how he approached melody, how he built solos around emotion first and technique second. Eddie showed Ace some of his tricks, the specific ways he'd modified his guitar to achieve the sounds he wanted. The crowd that had gathered to watch a confrontation found themselves witnessing a masterclass. Two completely different approaches to the same instrument, both valid, both powerful, both serving different purposes. Paul Stanley walked in at some point, saw what was happening, and just smiled. He'd known Ace could do this stuff. The world underestimated Ace because of the makeup, but Paul had always known the truth. Ace Frehley was one of the most talented guitarists in rock music. He just chose to be part of something larger than his own ego. Eventually, their jam session wound down. Eddie and Ace were both sweating, both grinning, both having experienced something unexpected and valuable. You know what I learned tonight? Eddie said. I learned that I was being a snob. I thought because Van Halen is about musical virtuosity and KISS is about theater, that meant we were somehow more legitimate. But you guys are legitimate too, just in a different way. And I learned, Ace said, that I need to push myself more technically. You made me realize I've gotten comfortable. I can do more. I should do more. Maybe not in KISS, but in my own playing, my own projects. They shook hands, but it felt like more than just a handshake. It felt like mutual recognition, like two masters in different disciplines acknowledging each other's mastery. We should do this again, Eddie said. Get together, just play, learn from each other. I'd like that, Ace agreed. They did get together again several times over the years, sometimes just to jam, sometimes to work on ideas, sometimes just to hang out and talk about guitars and life and music. They became friends, real friends, built on that night in Oakland when a confrontation turned into a collaboration. Years later, in a 1996 interview, Eddie Van Halen was asked about his influences and guitarists he respected. His answer surprised the interviewer. Ace Frehley is massively underrated. People see the makeup and think it's a gimmick, but Ace can play, really play. He's got technique, he's got feel, he's got everything. I learned that the hard way when I basically challenged him and he proceeded to play my own song back at me. It was humbling and educational. Ace taught me that there's more than one way to be a great guitarist. Ace, characteristically, was more modest when asked about the same encounter. Eddie and I just jammed one night. It was fun. He's incredible, obviously. Changed guitar playing. I learned a lot from him. But I think maybe he learned that the KISS guys aren't just clowns in makeup. We can actually play our instruments. The story became legendary in guitar circles. Different versions emerged over the years, some exaggerated, some simplified. But the core remained true. Two guitarists from different worlds met, challenged each other, and walked away with greater respect for each other's approach. The incident also changed how some people viewed KISS. The narrative had always been that they were more show than substance. But when Eddie Van Halen, the guitar prodigy who'd revolutionized the instrument, publicly stated his respect for Ace Frehley's abilities, it forced a reconsideration. Maybe KISS was both spectacle and substance. Maybe the two weren't mutually exclusive. For Ace, the encounter reinforced something he'd always believed but sometimes doubted during harsh criticism. He was a real guitarist, not just a guy in makeup, not just part of a show. A real musician with real abilities who'd chosen to apply those abilities in service of entertainment rather than pure technical exhibition. And there was nothing wrong with that choice. For Eddie, it was a reminder about assumptions and ego. He'd walked into that dressing room confident in his superiority, certain that theatrical bands were lesser than technically focused bands. He'd walked out understanding that superiority is a false concept. There are only different approaches, different philosophies, different ways of connecting with audiences. None inherently better than the others. The practice amp they'd used that night, the one Ace had plugged Eddie's guitar into to play Eruption, became a piece of rock history. The road case Eddie had sat on while watching Ace play was later marked with a Sharpie by someone who'd been there. Eddie met his match, August '79. In the decades that followed, whenever young guitarists would debate technical virtuosity versus emotional playing, older musicians who knew the story would bring up that night in Oakland. The night Eddie Van Halen learned not to judge a guitarist by his costume. The night Ace Frehley proved that spectacle and substance weren't opposing forces. The night two legends challenged each other and both came away better for it. Sometimes the best education comes from being wrong. And sometimes the best friendships start with someone proving you misjudged them. Eddie Van Halen and Ace Frehley both learned that lesson in a cramped dressing room in Oakland, surrounded by equipment and egos and eventually mutual respect. The last time they saw each other, years before Eddie's death in 2020, Ace reminded Eddie of that night. "Remember when you asked if I could handle Van Halen material?" Eddie laughed. "I was such an arrogant kid. You should have punched me." "Nah," Ace said. "I did something better. I played your guitar and made you rethink everything." "You did," Eddie agreed, "and I'm grateful for it. You made me a better musician and a better person." "Same," Ace said. "You pushed me to not settle, to keep challenging myself even if I don't always show it publicly." That was the real legacy of that night. Not just a cool story about two guitar heroes meeting, but a genuine exchange of ideas, a mutual elevation, a moment when competition gave way to collaboration and ego gave way to respect. In a business full of confrontations and rivalries, it stood out as something rarer, a confrontation that made both people better.